Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to all of our attendees. Welcome to ULA Fall Workshop, virtual edition this year. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Azra Basic, and I am the Adult Services Librarian at the Salt Lake City Public Library, and I'm the member of Continuing Education Committee. I'll be responsible for hosting today's presentation. It is my pleasure to welcome Kristen Nilsson, who is the Children's Librarian for the Summit County Libraries. Hi, Kirsten.
Hi.
In her own words, she really misses seeing her little people at the library, but she's enjoying being stretched in creative ways. She recently launched a kids cooking show, Kirsten's Kitchen Adventures, for the library's Facebook page. She also spends a lot of time traveling around the county to film various enthusiastic librarians reading picture books for weekly virtual story times. She's married with 4 children and a miniature golden doodle puppy named Pippi after Pippi Longstocking. She's a redhead. In this session, the nuts and bolts of building an inclusive children's library collection, Kirsten will explore how to conduct a diverse audit of our children's collections. She will provide us with suggestions for finding balanced book reviews and reliable book lists to diversify our collection. She will also identifying and avoiding cultural tropes and stereotypes in picture books and middle readers, including rather than othering. In our own book talks, the value of own voices and authors, and a plethora of inclusive book recommendations. This presentation will be recorded and available on the ULA website shortly. If you are interested in the closed caption, please click on the CC icon in the control panel window. At the end of this presentation, Kirsten will answer questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, you need to select the icon raise hand, and then I will unmute you so you can ask your question, or you can just simply type your question in the chat section and we'll get to it. If we run out of time, you are welcome to reach out to Kirsten to her email, knilsson@summitcounty.org. And now here's our special guest, Kristen Nilsson.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Azra. I appreciate that introduction, and I'm grateful to have been invited to participate today. I did want to tell you right from the beginning that if you attended the Youth Services Roundtable in January at the Salt Lake City Library or in February at the St. George Library, this is basically the same presentation. So you're welcome to switch over to another one if that would be more beneficial for you. And this is a very basic introduction to looking more carefully at our children's collections. So let me start by talking a little bit about Linda Sue Park, who is an author that most of you probably know or are aware of. She was a Newbery Award winner for her book, A Single Shard, several years ago. And most recently, she published a book called Prairie Lotus, which is wonderful, and numerous other children's books in between. And she gave a remarkable TED Talk where she posed the question, can books make readers better people? And I think we would all agree as librarians that yes, books can make readers better people. And the question that I'd like for us to think about today is exactly how does that happen? And how can we as libraries and educators and parents help make it happen? So looking at Jacqueline Woodson and me, you would think that we are about as different as 2 women could be. She's Black. I am obviously white. She is a married lesbian woman with 2 younger children. I am a married straight woman with 4 grown children. She grew up in the southern United States and moved to Brooklyn. I grew up on the close to the beach in Southern California and moved to Utah. And you might also think that her memoir, Brown Girl Dreaming, would be a book that I wouldn't necessarily relate to or be particularly interested in, but that is definitely not the case. As I read this stunningly beautiful memoir, the first thing that struck me was that we are almost exactly the same age. I lived in Washington, D.C. for a short time and as a child, and I remember, in fact, the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated, and so does she. We were both 6 at the time, and I'm sure that I remember it much differently than she does. But I've also been keenly interested in the Great Migration and the Civil Rights Movement for a number of years. And so more and more commonalities drew me to into her story. And when I was reading it for the first time, I'm not sure why, but I'd woken up early in the morning, and I finished reading it about 4:30, and I held it like dramatically literally across my heart, and just sobbed and sobbed. It moved me so much. And I immediately got up and wrote her an email and just said, this was a fantastic novel. Thank you so much. It's amazing that two women who seem to be so different could really relate to each other, or at least that's the way that I felt. And she actually wrote me back right after that, which was kind of exciting. But I had seen my own story in another woman's story whose life couldn't really have been more different than my own. But the most important thing was that she had reached my 12-year-old self in this very poignant and significant way. And I knew that despite all of the obvious differences, we were alike in many profound ways. In fact, we were far more alike than we were different. So in 1990, a woman by the name of Rudine Sim Bishop wrote a pivotal essay about diverse books in children's literature. And I'd like to read you just a little part of what she says. Books are sometimes windows, offering views of worlds that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange. These windows are also sliding glass doors, and readers have only to walk through in imagination to become part of whatever world has been created and recreated by the author. When lighting conditions are just right, however, a window can also be a mirror. Literature transforms human experience and reflects it back to us. And in that reflection, we can see our own lives and experiences as part of the larger human experience. Reading then becomes a means of self-affirmation, and readers often seek their mirrors in books. And incidentally, Rudine Sim Bishop was chosen to deliver the 2021 ALSC Children's Literature Lecture at ALA Midwinter. So that'll be fun to look forward to in January. So in books, she mentioned, and you've probably heard the whole windows, mirrors, doors reference many times. So in mirrors, we see ourselves as a larger part of the human experience. And in windows, we're able to look into someone else's life that's different from our own. And with sliding doors, there's an interaction and an exchange. So I love this quote from Maya Angelou. And I have to say, I just have to say, wow, building our children's collections to be more inclusive is a huge, huge topic. And there are so many directions that we could take and so much to learn to help all of us become more aware and more sensitive and more inclusive of each other. And we've heard the phrase now more than ever a lot during this unsettling time of pandemic and racial tension and political unrest. And it's something to remember, though, that now more than ever, we need to be thinking about each other and building empathy and compassion. And this can be kind of a difficult topic to talk about. And somehow I feel a little bit afraid of misstepping or unintentionally offending someone. But we can't learn about it if we don't talk about it. And if there were ever a time that we need to talk about it, now more than ever, that time would be right now. So we can't be afraid to talk about it. And even if we say the wrong thing or make a mistake, which I may very well do today, we need to see other people and we need to listen to each other. And we need to recognize that we have differences and commonalities and that we need to honor each other's own experiences, personal experiences. So let's start from where we are, and as we learn together, try to do better, as Maya Angelou so eloquently has said. All right, so when we talk about diversity, what are we really talking about? oops, I think I skipped a slide. Let's go back. Yes, that one, the one that I just said. So the standard understanding is that diversity highlights a set of traits and characteristics a person or community possesses that are different in some way from the mainstream population. And libraries, as cultural institutions, uphold that dominant culture and its systems by default. We order the books that the publishers have invested in, and they invest in the books that they think will sell. And the people that will buy the books are, anyway, so with this increased awareness and sensitivity, we can work towards greater equity and representation, and we can be more deliberate about the books that we order. So a few years ago, I thought about putting multicultural stickers on our picture books because I thought it would help broaden the choices of our patrons. And I was soon faced with this kind of puzzling conundrum because I represent the dominant culture. And so by putting a multicultural sticker on a book, am I othering that culture or that person who might be a part of that culture by saying that this is not a part of the dominant culture? Anyway, I would say, yes, I am, that we're all multicultural. I still have those stickers on, but it always makes me think. Anyway, greater diversity is not the goal. Greater equity and representation and inclusion is the goal. So there's a man named Derek Gay. He is a diversity consultant, and he spoke last fall at the Minnesota Library Association. And I really like what he had to say about diversity. He said, it's a good idea to think about diversity in terms of differences rather than one group being different than the norm, so that we're all different from each other. And again, if you think about, well, what is the norm? The norm is relative. And I mean, my experience with the multicultural stickers illustrates. So in today's world, the ability to communicate with and respect and collaborate with similar and different people is a critical skill to success. And learning about someone else's life journey or culture creates empathy. And with empathy, we can see the world the way someone else might see it. And another really remarkable TED Talk is by Grace Lin, and it's called The Windows and Mirrors of Your Child's Bookshelf. And it had some great insights about what it was like for her to grow up in the United States without seeing herself in any of the books that she read. Her parents were immigrants from China, and she did not want to be Chinese and didn't associate herself with that culture at all. And it wasn't until she was in college that she realized that that was an important part of who she was. And so happily for us, that's when she wrote When the Mountain Meets the Moon, which was also a Newbery winner. And she really embraced her cultural heritage. And we also have the book, A Moon Cake for Little Star, which is a darling picture book. So I'm glad that she was able to figure that out, but it's really insightful about just what it means to not see yourself as you're growing up in the books around you. So obviously there are all these variations of diversity, and they can't all be contained in one book. In fact, it would be a disaster if they were. But it takes a lot of books to create a multi-dimensional look at a culture. And so as librarians, we of course want to have as broad a spectrum of stories in our collections as possible, so that our readers can get the most accurate and richest picture of the world around them. I think a lot of times we only think of the first two categories in this list, race and ethnicity, when we think about diverse characters in children's books, but there are lots more stories. And this is a subject that I've become particularly passionate about for very personal reasons. I have a son who happens to be gay, and he came out to us 13 years ago, and now he's 29, or when he was 13, not 13 years ago. Now he's 29, so it was 16, but anyway. When he was a young teenager, we were in a bookstore, And he found a novel that had some LGBTQ characters. And this was before I worked for the library, probably 15 years ago. Anyway, he really wanted this book. And I'm embarrassed to admit that I said no, because I was scared and I didn't know any better. And I should have bought the book and let him read it and read it myself. And in retrospect, I realized that he really needed to find characters that were like him in a book. And it would have made his pretty difficult lonely, difficult teenage years a little easier. So since then, I've been on this kind of crusade to help people broaden their perspective and try to understand each other a little bit better. Anyway, so what would you guess are the percentages of diverse characters and cultures in children's books? How much representation do these books get in children's literature? And here's another graphic that you might have already seen. This is from the Cooperative Children's Book Center from the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And they looked at every children's book published by mainstream publishers in 2015 and created this graphic. And I just love it. If you look at the boy with the orange shirt on the right-hand side, look at all the mirrors he's got around him. He's got a mirror ball. He's got one of those cool mirrors that you can look at your shoes in. He's reflected all around. And then if you look at the other end with this Native American girl, I think maybe a boy, that he or she's holding out a rock in front of them, and maybe they can see a tiny little reflection in the rock. But I think this is a great graphic. You'll notice that if we add together books about animals, trucks, etc., and books with white characters, then we come up with 85.8% of the books that were published in 2015 had white characters and did not have diversity. And so this was their baseline study, and it's been almost 5 years, and you would think that things have changed. So let's see. This is the same graphic that they did for 2018, and things have changed. If you look, 50% of the books are about white characters. However, the books about animals and other have increased to 27%. So still 77% of the books published. And American Indians and First Nations has only improved by 0.1%. So not a huge improvement. There's still like a broken mirror behind the African American person standing there. And anyway, but this is 2019, and actually in 2018, and in 2019, in February of this year, the same Cooperative Children's Book Center released the latest numbers, and they continue to steadily increase, which is really good news. So this last year, 31% of children's books were published by and or about Black people of color and Indigenous people. So that's compared to 23% in 2018. So there is an improvement, and I think it feels to me like it's really continuing to increase. An interesting thing about animals and inanimate objects like trucks, they're also not the best way to convey a feeling of inclusivity and equity. I think stories with people and other kids who may or may not look different than the reader does are much more immediate and accessible when it comes to these kinds of issues. I'm thinking about the book And Tango Makes Three, which a lot of people point to as a book for introducing LGBTQ issues. If you're not familiar with it, you might want to look at it, but it's about penguins. And it might be hard to tell that story about people, but we can tell that story about people. And there are books out there with those kinds of stories. So one question we need to ask is, who are these books intended for, these diverse books? They're not only intended for, quote, diverse readers. Again, back to Jacqueline Woodson, I heard her at a lecture at the University of Utah a couple of years ago, and she was talking about a teacher who approached her when she was giving a presentation, and she said, oh, you know, we have a pretty homogeneous society or I mean community, and we don't have a lot of diversity, so we don't have your books on our shelves. And she she said she responded very graciously, but very firmly. I'm not sure I would want to cross Jacqueline Woodson. And she stated that her books were for everyone. And so she definitely needed to order those books and have them on her shelves available to everyone, which is a great idea, the best idea. So let's talk about how we evaluate books in our collections and how do we make our collections full and vibrant and reflective of today's pluralistic society. So the visual and verbal messages that young children absorb from books and other media heavily influence their ideas about themselves and about others. Children's books teach children about who is important, who matters, and who is even visible. And although it may seem subtle, it's meaningful for us as librarians to recognize who is not being represented in children's books. Sometimes we don't think about that. And we need to consider the impact that that may have on all of our patrons and our children. So this book is probably one I hope you all have in your collection already. It's called Fry Bread by Kevin Noble Maillard. And when we're evaluating these books on our shelves, what should we be looking for? So do the characters always have to be good role models? I would say no. The mark of a maturing literature is that it contains characters who are both strong and weak and make both good and bad decisions. And I have this book up here particularly because glossaries and maps and other supplementary information sometimes can overwhelm the reader, but also sometimes it's very helpful. And in this book, I think it's wonderful that Kevin Noble Maillard included his family's fry bread recipe at the end of the book. It just makes it so fun. And if you haven't looked at this book, you need to. It's wonderful. Another thing that we need to watch out for is sensationalism and sentimentality, and we really need to avoid both of those things. So this next book is one that I discovered not too long ago. It's about the illustrator, the woman, her name is Gio Fujikawa, and she was an illustrator in the middle of the 20th century, and which was a time that was not easy for women, and it was not particularly easy for Japanese. In fact, her parents were held in a Japanese internment camp while she was living and working in New York City. And she fought at that time fiercely with her publishers to have kids of all kinds represented, playing with each other side by side in her books. And she won. And this is she's just a delightful author illustrator. But I wanted to read this 2-page spread. We can read it together. I just love what it says because it encapsulates so much of what I think we're trying to do. It says, finally, the publisher said yes. And the book did well, very well. Babies loved it. So Gio kept going, welcoming kids in from the edges, from the corners, from the shadows. Gio let each child find a place. Girls and boys freed from pink or blue, sharing jokes, joys, mishaps, bruises, all sprawling out across the bright page, ready for a bigger, better world. So I would recommend this picture book biography as well as the books that she publishes for toddlers. They're in a board book format. Okay, so something we need to watch for as we're looking at our books is checking the illustrations, and we really want to look for stereotypes. So I found a book in our collection as I was looking at our picture book collection. Babar Comes to America. I know some of us have really fond feelings for Babar, but this book had a lot of difficulties for me in it. For instance, people of color in the book were the waiters at the lunch counter. Literally, there was a lunch counter drawn with white people on one side and then the black waiters on the other side. They were also represented as the mechanics and the porters for the train. There were no people of color at the university that Babar visits when he's in America. and there were no people of color in his host's suburban neighborhood or at the museums and the landmarks that he visits. There weren't any Latinos in Los Angeles, which is impossible. And Babar finds some Indians at the Grand Canyon at the very end, where they all dress and dance in full ceremonial headdress. And then even Celeste, Babar's beloved wife, can't resist going back to Paris without a full-length fur coat. So this book was published in 1965, granted, and times have changed significantly since then. But do they need it? Do the kids need this book? So that's a loaded question that we could spend the hours talking about. And it's a tricky question. And we need to think about what we do with the books that are already in our collection that might offend someone or might present some difficult issues. You could sit down with a 5-year-old and talk to them about the civil rights movement and how things have changed for the people that were not represented in this book, but I think it'd be kind of a difficult conversation and one that a 5-year-old might not really be interested in. So it's important to remember, at least for me as a public librarian, that we are not an academic library and we don't need to keep everything that we have. But that's not to say that I'm telling you to delete these books, because frankly, I don't know the answer. And maybe if you have an answer to that, you could bring it up at the end of our discussion today. So, but the good news is that there are so many great books. So we really have two options. We can delete those books that we might find not helpful and try to do that in a very unbiased way, or we can redirect our readers and perhaps not put those books on display and let them stay on the shelves. There's lots of ways to handle that. So other things we want to look for when we're thinking about the books that we're ordering and the books that we're keeping in our collections are offensive stereotypes, tokenism, invisibility. Again, the books that, the things that are missing from the books in our collection. An example of, as far as stereotyping goes, all of the characters need to be individual. You need to be able to, they can't all look the same. And a great example, or a great bad example, would be the 5 Chinese brothers, which if you think about the cover of that book, all of those brothers look exactly the same. And some of the common stereotypes that we need to be aware of, I'm sure you can think of many, but we need to remember that strong, independent girls and women are not manlike, and book-loving, non-athletic boys are not effeminate. Latina mothers are not subservient. Arab men are not terrorists. American Indians do not carry bows and arrows with them all the time. And people with disabilities are independent and do not need to be pitied. Also, girls don't need to be rescued by a male character, just as people of color do not necessarily need a white person to help them out of bad situations. So I can go off on so many tangents, and I'll try not to, but books about, for instance, Blacks and slavery and the civil rights movement are all important, but they're not the only stories to have. We need to have much broader stories, and wonderfully, there are so many of those books that have been coming out in the last couple of years. So also tokenism, briefly, is when there's just one character that isn't very well developed, an African-American character or a Latino character that's there to represent all of that ethnic group. And that really only allows children to see one view of a group of people. And it doesn't have the diversity and variation that exists among all groups. And so that's kind of a tricky thing to identify, but tokenism is a good thing to look for. Also, as we mentioned a couple of times already, is the whole idea of invisibility and what children don't see in their books that teaches them who matters and who doesn't matter in society. Some examples of that would be families who live in rural areas, blue collar workers, families with 2 moms or 2 dads. single mothers or fathers, homeless families, families with an incarcerated parent, Muslim families, transgender adults and children. I've noticed a big increase in books with broader stories and more inclusive storylines over the last couple of years, as I've mentioned, and there are just so many. So it's kind of an exciting time. An example of not using stereotypes is this great graphic novel by George Takei, who you might recognize from Star Trek. But he recently came out with this really lovely graphic novel called They Called Us Enemy. And it's about his family's experience in a Japanese internment camp. But the interesting thing about it is that it's told from a child's point of view. And he remembers all the things that every child will remember. He remembers the train ride, and he remembers birthday parties that they had and the friends that he made. But he also remembers the anger that his parents felt, and how afraid of the soldiers and the guns that they carried, that they were, and the barbed wire that surrounded their camps. So I love this. This is just one of the illustrations, obviously, in the book. And you can see so well how individual those little boys are and how scared they are. And I'm just struck by how the illustrator is able to do that. And also, I love the bottom panel where it says, the father says, "My family, I need to help them get ready." And the soldiers respond, 10 minutes. So they only have 10 minutes to get themselves out of their house forever, which they didn't necessarily know that that was going to be the case. So we want to consider the effects on children's self and social identities. And we need to evaluate specific books like we've talked about already, but also our book collections. So do our books reinforce or counteract messages that teach children to feel inferior or superior because of their skin color or gender or family income or able-bodiedness or type of family structure? And will all of the children we serve find themselves and their family's way of life reflected in our book collections? So these are some problematic books that have come up over the years. And like I said before, we need to be careful of misrepresentation and stereotyping. And I don't want to crush your beloved authors, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but be warned that once you start thinking about this and looking into these things, you can find all kinds of issues. So the first one I want to talk about is Tiki Tiki Tembo, which may be a book that you're familiar with or not. And this has all kinds of difficulties. My children loved this book when they were young. And it's about, we're not really sure, Chinese, Japanese family. That's one of the problems, is that those two cultures are kind of melded together all into one. And the parents name one of their kids a very short name, and then that I don't remember. And then they name the other child a really, really long name. And he falls into the well. And anyway, you don't need to know the details, but it's just got all kinds of stereotyping. And it's a really good example of one of those kinds of books that we're watching out for. Now, Skippy John Jones is a more modern series of books, and it's about a Siamese cat who wants to be Mexican Chihuahua. There's a lot of stereotyping in this book as well. And if you're close to my age, it reminded me a little bit of the whole Frito Bandito controversy. In fact, it's interesting to me because the objections to this book come to address the language. So Spanglish has actually been identified as a language that has grammatical markers and systems. And Skippy John Jones, instead of using that language of Spanglish, where you mix English and Spanish together, or even using real Spanish words, the author has just put the ending ito onto everything that the cat says. So it's really pretty offensive if you're a Spanish-speaking person. And I've heard people say, "Oh, my kids love the Skippy John Jones books. They think they're hilarious, and what does it hurt?" And I guess I would respond that we need to think about all the kids that are reading these books. And if you were to read Skippy John Jones perhaps in a Mexican-American classroom in Southern California, I think they would be hurt. I think they would be offended. So we need to take those things into consideration as well, and what, even though our kids might not even, get the nuances of that, it's still problematic. And then the last one I'll just talk about briefly, A Fine Dessert, was a book that came out that I just fell in love with. I thought it was such a great premise. It's about the dessert blackberry crumble and how it evolved over 4 centuries. And the problem with this book was that in the 19th century, it's an enslaved woman who prepares the blackberry crumble for the family that she serves. And then she and her daughter are depicted in the closet smiling and sneaking a taste of the blackberry crumble. And the reaction to that was that there was an insensitivity towards the brutality of slavery, which I would agree with. And when I read it, it didn't even occur to me. But the author actually apologized. And I just think it's interesting to think about. I mean, I'm sure it was unintentional on her part, but those are good things to consider when we're thinking about the kind of books that we have in our collection. So there's an entirely other discussion about what we should do with these books. Do we keep them out of our collections? Do we leave them on the shelves? I mentioned this briefly before. And there's more and more beloved titles, mostly beloved by white readers, that have some difficulties. For instance, Little House on the Prairie, which we won't go into, but it's something to think about. Okay, so another thing to watch for is authenticity. And you are probably aware of the Own Voices movement and the idea that people who are members of a particular culture or ethnic group would write about their own experiences, and that they would have that authenticity to lend. And I have to take my hat off, if I wore one, to Rick Riordan, which you'd have to be hiding under a rock to not know about Rick Riordan's amazing career. But he's written all these books, like The Lightning Thief and the Norse mythology books and the Red Pyramid, and that are about various mythologies. And he was approached a few years ago by multiple people who asked, "Oh, can you write a book about Korean mythology? Or can you write a book about Mexican American mythology, or Native American mythology, or African American?" And he said no, wisely, but he said, "But I can find the authors who will do that." And so they created the imprint at Disney Hyperion called Rick Riordan Presents. That's where that's all come from. And this one I just read recently, Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky, which is a great adventure story full of African-American tales, from folk tales and tales that they told each other as enslaved people. And it's great. I loved it. Another one that I read not too long ago was Paula Santiago and the River of Tears, which is by, I can't remember the author right now, but it's a story of La Llorona, the weeping woman who haunts the river looking for her children who have drowned. And it's a Mexican-American tale, and it's fantastic also. So kudos to Rick Riordan for doing that. I just want to check my time really fast. Okay. So a question to ask, though, is whether or not someone outside of that culture can write a book that is good. And it's kind of been an issue lately. In fact, in adult fiction, the book American Dirt, where there was a big controversy over that recently. And I would say that, yes, we would be missing out on a lot of books if that were the only qualification that we asked, that they were all own voices books. But those authors really need to do their research, and we just need to be careful when we're making those choices. Okay, so this is the fun part. These are more examples of really great diverse books. The first one, Jamil Saeed Mendez, Where Are You From?, is about a girl who approaches her grandfather because she's always being asked, where are you from? And she'll say, well, I'm from here. And then they'll say, no, where are you really from? So she goes to her abuelo, and he tells her this beautiful story about where her ancestors have come from, and that she comes from this family that's full of love and sorry, I lost my place. Full of love and respect and appreciation for their heritage. So that's a great one. And then Juliana's a Mermaid is just this wonderful celebration of individuality and respect and acceptance. And the last one, Prairie Lotus, is Linda Sue Park's response to A Little House on the Prairie, or Little House on the Prairie. I mean, the Little House books by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And it's just this really great intersectional story of a Chinese family who also lived on the prairie. And the postscript to this novel is particularly interesting. So those are some that I loved. Here are some others. This one, If You Come to Earth by Sophie Blackwell, just came out like a week or two ago, and it's fantastic. It's all about the diversity if a visitor from outer space came to Earth and what they would encounter. And she actually wrote it because of her work with UNICEF and the Save the Children foundations, that she's traveled all over the world meeting all these different children, and it's delightful. Free Lunch is another great story. It's a memoir of that deals with poverty and abuse and how hard it is to be in middle school. And then I know I'm a little bit late to the party, but this last one, Genesis Begins Again, is another great story that I think lots of kids can relate to, because middle school is hard and you want to fit in, and it addresses all of those difficult issues. So some of these things, I'm not going to read through these, but you can look through them and see the things that we need to watch for, again, when we're choosing books for our collection. And I have found that Kirkus Reviews include a commentary on whether or not there are diverse characters in the book, always in their reviews. And they also say if it defaults to white characters. There was an interesting article in School Library Journal a couple of months ago that Linda Sue Park wrote, that she said that they need to identify, they can't just default to white characters in their reviews, but they need to say there are white characters or Black or, Mexican American, whatever the case may be, which they haven't done before. So the School Library Journal is a great place to find reviews of these books, as well as Kirkus. Children need to find themselves in the books, and they need to see other points of view. So we can conduct a diversity audit on part of our collection. Certainly we can't do the entire collection. We can't even do the entire picture book collection. But if you break it down, you could do your picture books from A to D, for instance. And you can identify common data points, like the main characters, the author, illustrator, director, the race that's included in the book, ethnicity, if there's a disability, LGBTQ characters or issues, gender identity. You could use those CCBC categories and create a spreadsheet, and then just identify to be able to see what you have in your own collections, because we manage what we measure. So if we know how much we have, then we can get more. And think about even what you read in your book groups, or I know a lot of us are doing picture book kits now with some of the libraries being closed. And do we include diverse books in those in those book kits, or even in our, I have a mother-daughter book group at our library, and it's caused me to think about the books that I choose. Are they always with white characters? And they don't need to be, and they shouldn't be. So then when we identify it, then we can decide where we need to improve, and what we need to order, what we need to have more of, and we can select all of those new materials with intention. And we can research and order more books about a wide variety of people and experiences. So we can also do some things in our libraries right away. We can create inclusive displays. So even though it's Black History Month, we can display books with Black characters all the time, not just during that month. It's important to see them all year round. And when I was working on this, I was really excited about it. So I created this diversity book display. And I came up with this great diversity quote, and I chose all these books with diverse characters, and not one book checked out. And then I switched it up, and I made a display with books about kindness and being thoughtful to each other. And I included almost all the same books, and then they all checked out. So we need to be careful about how we market it, and be careful not to other people or make people feel left out. We want to make them feel included. Kids are so resilient, and they're constantly curious. And if these really excellent, diverse books with diverse characters are not circulating, we're not doing our jobs as librarians. We need to feature them more. We need to read them so that we can recommend them. There was a middle school student in our library before we closed, obviously, and she was really looking for the One Crazy Summer series. And I just wanted to follow her around and ask her, like, so what did you like about these books? So how, they're hilarious, Rita Garcia Williams, and really great. But it just made me happy that she was looking for those books. So we need to read widely and diversely, and we can focus on even our personal reading choices as librarians. And we can read about books. We can read the reviews, and perhaps not read the most popular books, even though we might be excited about the ones that are coming out, and spend our time reading the books that need our recommendation, the books that are less well known, because those popular books will get read no matter what. We don't need to recommend them. So we can diversify our recommendations. All right. Now, so I want to just ask you, which book sounds more interesting to you if I were to pitch a book? Okay, so this is a Newbery Award-winning book that's interwoven with Chinese fairy tales. Or the same book, I could say, this is an amazing adventure story where a 12-year-old girl fights dragons and fierce beasts so that she can be reunited with her parents. And which one do you think a kid would find more interesting? Obviously the second one, because it's identifying the commonalities, and it's looking for the universals and emphasizing those to whoever you're recommending it to. I just had to throw this book in because it's phenomenal, and everyone should read it. I'm just gonna go quick because I know I'm behind time. All right, so in conclusion, we come back to Jacqueline Woodson, and I think we will agree that books can make readers better people, and that when we read about other people and other cultures, we develop empathy. And again, we come back to this quote that, let's do better. Now that we know better, let's be better and be more deliberate about the books that we add to our collection so that we can help our readers and our library patrons develop empathy and to therefore become better people. The end. So I do have a resource list here, and these slides obviously will be available to all of you. I wanted to point out really quick that even, I don't know how many of you order from Baker & Taylor, but on Baker & Taylor, if you go to the browse section and then there's selection lists and then the Kirkus collections, there are all these different subjects which are absolutely amazing and widely detailed to help you in your book choices. So I'm sorry I've taken a little bit longer than I anticipated. Maybe we have time for just a few questions, Azra, if there are some, and if not, then we can just end there. I'm going to turn it back to you, Azra.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. I hope you all enjoyed this really great presentation. We do have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions if anybody has anything ready. I don't see anything in the chat section, but you can also raise your hand and I will unmute your mic. If not, you can always reach out to Kristen to her email, knilsson, Nilsson @summitcounty.org. Okay, I see that we have some nice comments for your presentation. I agree, this has been really wonderful presentation. And as I said, we have been recording this webinar and it will be available on the ULA website. So if you want to go and revisit all these amazing recommendations by Kirsten, that the webinar will be available on the ULA website. Okay, well, I'm just gonna go ahead and thank you, Kirsten, again. This was a great presentation. It was a pleasure to have you with us. I'm going to conclude our webinar with this, and thank you all for attending. We hope you learned and enjoyed this presentation, and our next session starts at 2:45.
Thank you, Azra.
You're welcome.